Welcome to the Seminole Wars. In this podcast, we explore how the Seminole Wars came to be, how they were fought, and how they still resonate some 2 centuries later. I am your host, Patrick Swan, and our show is a production of the Seminole Wars Foundation, found online at www.seminolewars.us. We are recording today from the homestead of the Foundation in Bushnell, Florida. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome. In 1830, the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, aimed to relocate Indian tribes in the southeastern United States to undetermined land across the Mississippi River in the Oklahoma Territory. The tribes affected were the Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, the so-called 4C tribes, and the Seminole of Florida. The Army and Indian agents forcibly evicted thousands among the 4C tribes. The tragic tale of this unjust trail of tears rips at our collective hearts to this day. When removal efforts came to the Seminole of Florida, however, some departed voluntarily, but the majority stood their ground and refused to be moved. With us today to discuss why they resisted removal is Dr. Joe Knetsch. Joe is the author of a number of books and journal articles on the Seminole Wars. His anthology, Fear and Anxiety on the Florida Frontier, articles on the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, informs our discussion today. Dr. Joe Knetsch, welcome to the Seminole Wars. First up, tell us about your book, The Fear and Anxiety on the Florida Frontier. It's a collection of articles you'd written over many years. Why compile them all into one volume, and what are the themes?
Well, the reason for compiling them all in one volume and using a Jackson Walker cover, which always makes everything attractive, is the fact that most of my publications were published in a lot of the local historical journals, like the At Home out of Citrus County, and those kind of things. And many of the quote-unquote scholars, yourself and others accepted, don't look in those local places. So to put it all in a convenient form for people to use and be able to cite it more accurately, we decided to put it into one form. And that's how we got it through the Seminole Wars Foundation, who were gracious enough to publish it.
In the table of contents, you've broken it up into a couple themes.
Yeah, we tried to make it somewhat easier to handle for people who were looking at the beginning of the war or what was going on during the war, how it impacted individuals. Probably one of the finest diaries I've ever read, just for the gossip, if nothing else. And he makes most women look very tame when it comes to gossip. There's the Samuel Heintzelman stuff that we got when he was the quartermaster here in Tallahassee. It is, shall we say, delicious when it comes to good gossip of the day. And he talked about a lot of people that I know from my research at the Bureau of Survey and Mapping, Division of State Lands at DEP, who are the surveyors. People like A.M. Randolph, Arthur Murray Randolph, who is indeed one of the Randolphs of Virginia, by the way. He also talked about Henry Washington, who BLM considered one of the finest surveyors in BLM history. It gives you an idea that this is a pretty classy place. There's always the raucous frontier, of course, but Tallahassee had a lot more class to it than most people want to give it credit for. Just because it doesn't have it today doesn't mean it didn't have it then.
So Fear and Anxiety on the Florida Frontier, it talks about the Second Seminole War. And I mentioned about Indian removals. So why did the Seminole resist removal?
Well, there are a couple of very good reasons. First of all, this was their homeland. They had been here off and on. I think Patsy West has done a lot of research on this. They go back to at least the middle 1700s. They were not just recent immigrants to Florida. They had been here off and on for a lot of years. One of the major reasons they fought was because it was very obvious that the United States government was going to put them under the Creeks out west. And, of course, they've been fighting for about 200 years for independence from the Creek Confederation, or whatever domination you want to call it, whether it was Confederation or what, sometimes up to some kind of question. But they were not going to put themselves under Creek leadership in any way, shape, or form. Later on in the war, when Cloud and Micanopy and Jumper and a few others were discussing it, going out to the west with Jessup, they insisted that they must take their blacks with them, which has created some recent controversy, as we all know, out in Oklahoma, because they want to deny the blacks the right to have any funds from the federal government as far as things are going there. I like to point out the fact that they insisted that the blacks go with them out to Oklahoma, and Jessup agreed. He was just anxious to get the war over and get out of here, and we all understand the reason for that. But it was a brutal war, as we all know, and that's one of the reasons and the fascinations for this, because it was the longest, most continuous Indian war in American history, and also the most costly, and men lost, and that's just federal soldiers, I might add, and money spent, around $30 million, which I hate to even look at what it translates to today, but it'd be pretty close to $1 billion. It was an extraordinarily expensive endeavor to try to remove the Seminoles, and they never did totally succeed, knock on wood.
Right. How has the Seminole resistance differed from any other resistance by the so-called 4C tribes?
I think it's actually better led. That's one of the key factors right there. The leadership of the Seminole warrior group, let's put it that way. I don't use the word chiefs. The reason being that they all take things in the headmen of the local village. Now, you know the situation as far as it's all done through tribal council. There is no quote-unquote chief in what white man's terms are. And I like to leave it at that because I'm not a Seminole or Miccosukee, and therefore I'm not privy to the interiors of what goes on today or through the oral history that they have received from little children on. I am on the Governor Councils for Indian Affairs. Doesn't make me an expert on Indian culture, even though I worked with the Miccosukees and lived with the Seminoles for years in South Florida. I lived in that area. I was 3 blocks from the res down there. It's one of those situations where they constantly had to fight for their existence. They constantly had to establish things that, including a new government, if you will, and constantly being forced out of where they were. It's going to cause resistance every single time. Well, I think a lot of their resistance, of course, was the fact that they were already set, and they did have in front of them, if you will, and the network amongst the Native Americans is pretty good for the most part. They understood that those treaties were made, and that people like John Ross and others had committed the Cherokees to their destiny. The Seminoles saw that. They probably knew what was going on in the early years of the Trail of Tears, which preceded the Seminole War directly in most cases, and they saw that this is not what we want to do. It's not going to be for us. And of course, we all know that when they sent the Treaty of Payne's Landing, they sent some Indians, some of the Indians out west, and they came back. The report the government put out was, they accepted it and they wondered. That's not the tradition that we hear from the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes, that these people were basically forced, browbeaten, or beaten into, you're going to accept this no matter what. And don't forget, it's the American government who determined who's going to be negotiated with. That was not done with, notice none of these treaties were ever submitted to tribal council. Never. And tribal council were all decisions in the Seminole and Miccosukee, and the Creek tribes too, for that matter, and southeastern tribes. The tribal council is where the power is. And those are the ones who make the decision. The American government just totally ignored it. And if their appointee, like a John Hicks or some of the more pliable people, Charlie Amafla, look what happened to Charlie. I think that tells you everything you wanted to know about what at least the warrior group, those who wanted to resist, and thought that was the only realistic approach. Look what happened to Charlie Amafla. They made sure that his gold pieces didn't go any further.
I was reading that his brother then took out a number of Seminole with him, and they had a horrible time. They lost many from disease and from exposure and so forth in getting out to Oklahoma, which was another way of pointing out why removal was not a real good thing for them.
Absolutely. You're totally right. And believe me, the word got back. It's an amazing, like I said, the amazing intelligence system, if you want to use that phrase, was very, very remarkable amongst the Seminoles. The drive for land, cattle, land, etc., by the Wiregrass whites was just insatiable, no matter what. And the Seminoles and Miccosukees in Florida stood in their way. They weren't going to put up with that. I mean, this displacement of those who were opposed to any further settlement by whites was not going to be tolerated under any circumstance. And Seminoles knew this. They were well aware of this. That was really one of the reasons, going back to the days of Tecumseh, and what his, was all about. The same you could go back to the 1760s and Pontiac's Rebellion. The same kind of issues were coming up. The Indians knew very well this was not going to be a good thing. And if you resist, you may lose your life and you may lose your land. By God, you're not going to be removed from your homeland and from the graves of your father.
Yeah, it looked like with the 4 Sea tribes, the U.S. government was successful in divide and conquer. They got a number of folks to move, and then those who were remaining were not in the mass force that they could actually say, here we're going to stand and fight. Whereas with the Seminole, only a few had moved, and they still had the bulk of tribes and communities and so forth who could resist. You've written that the resistance led to open warfare, but that in the long history of the U.S. Army, the Second Seminole War was different from any other war U.S. troops fought. Why do you say this?
U.S. troops and U.S. Army and the federal government, generally speaking, they pretty much bullied their way through on the other civilized tribes of the Southeast and other places. It wasn't just them. They pretty much had gotten their way. They come to the Seminoles, and all of a sudden, boom, they're now into a fierce war that they were not planning for. Remember that when Dade's command was attacked and Constantine Smith and Wiley Thompson were killed at Ocala at Fort King, there were only 500 federal, in round numbers, 500 federal troops in the entire state or territory at that particular time. I mean, obviously they were not preparing for any kind of war on any extent. I mean, and that was not because they had not been warned and had not been, even Clinch himself had asked for more troops, saying this is not going to be easy, and others kind of poo-pooed it, and of course you have Jackson in power, who's been able to divide and conquer better than anyone in American history, at least. And he was very successful in removing the Indians. He did not ever expect to have the problem with the Seminoles that he wound up having, really blackening the record, shall we say, of the Jackson administration in any way, shape, or form. He never expected the Seminoles to do as well as they did. And that's a key factor in the history of our country and the history of the American Army. They were just not prepared. About 35 or 40% of the United States Army were foreign-born. Some of them didn't even speak English yet, let alone know how to fire a gun. And the training at that particular time was not sophisticated, not well organized. It was usually left up to the sergeants and corporals in the group they were assigned to. They were given a uniform before they were given a gun, and then they're sent to their new post, and it was supposed to be the non-commissioned officers who taught them how to fire, etc. God forbid you should have an officer actually go down and, teach anybody anything. They weren't capable, because we're military people. Many of them were, as you know, West Point grads at that point in time. The first real war where West Point officers predominated in the officer class, and they were not prepared by training and or education to do this kind of war. We had 7 generals overall in charge. Well, I think Worth was a colonel when he was given the command finally, but became a general. None of them were all that successful. Worth being probably the most successful because, well, frankly, it's the end of the war. The Seminoles are beaten down. They've lost nearly 4,000 people being emigrated or killed. We think that's the number. You can't really play a numbers game here because they're just what statistics are you going by and where would you get them? That's always amazed me that they say, well, there were 5,000 Indians in Florida. Really? That's that all you think? You had people that you had a fluid border, from Alabama through Georgia. It was a very porous thing. So you had Creeks, and remnants of the Amisees. You had all sorts of people, Native Americans, going through the borders and joining up with the Seminole. Of course, the number of escaped slaves who joined in, and of course the blacks who were already here. It's an amazing amalgamation of people who were fighting the American government. It wasn't just the Seminoles and Miccosukees. Others were involved in that. And if the enemy, my enemy is my friend attitude, you'll have a lot of people joining in. That's one of the reasons why some of the Red Stick faction from the Creek Wars, the Creek Civil Wars up there in Alabama, that's why they joined in with Florida quite readily. Neomahla being a great example of that.
Joe, you talked a little bit then, of course, about that this was not the war the Army wanted against this opponent or for as long as it was. And then you mentioned how unprepared the Army was. And yet, General Scott went north and fought the Creeks and brought them to heel in a relative short period of time. Why was he more successful there than in Florida? Or rather, why was he such a failure in Florida as compared to how he did up in Georgia?
Well, Winfield Scott wasn't very successful in Florida, and the Alabama campaign was conducted by Jessup before Scott even got there. Yeah, it kind of tipped off Scott, needless to say. Jessup had to almost apologize for being the victor in Alabama. It was kind of an interesting correspondence between the two men who had been friends, and then Scott got a little jealous when his underling went over and was successful so quickly against the remnants of the Red Sticks, really, is what that amounted to. But, take a look at Scott's campaign in Florida. It is a brilliantly planned assault, a three-pronged plan. The problem with that, and you know this as well as anybody because of your military training and career, you know that there was the logistics of that was impossible. He comes down here with a band, his entire camping equipment, complete with China, coming along, and is going to be leading one group out of the Fort Greene area, and then you got Lindsay coming up from Tampa, and got Abraham Eustis coming along into an area that was totally unmapped by any white man. And the fact that Eustis even made it across the Ocklawaha River is an amazement, frankly, when you consider what kind of territory he had to go through with absolutely no mapping of the state of Florida or the territory of Florida. We had, as I think Jessup put it in one of his letters home or back to the commanding officers, I said, we know less about the interior of Florida than we do the interior of Africa. David Livingstone never found was ever found, by Andrew Stanley.
And in contrast, they had mapped Alabama and Georgia. They were used to that terrain, and as you said, it was remnants of the Red Sticks. These folks had already been divided, and then they were easier to conquer going up there for these various reasons that you noted. Whereas in Florida, it was like going into dark Africa. They didn't know what the terrain was, and they weren't really prepared. And the Seminoles were united and not divided in whom they were fighting.
Exactly. And the Seminoles and Miccosseki's worked really well together. I think it's the only time where they agreed on one main spiritual leader in Sam Jones or Abiaka. Either way, he's the only one back in late 36, early 37. They basically agreed that he would be the kind of the spiritual head, and for want of a better phrase, the medicine carrier for the combined groups. That's the only time it's ever happened in their history. And I'm waiting anxiously for the day the biography of Sam Jones comes out. And Betsy's been working on it for a lot of years and really trying to tie all the very loose ends at sometimes together. He's an amazing character and an amazing feature on the frontier that is totally underrated because you never see it they talk about the great leaders, they talk about Osceola. Osceola was out of it by 37. Who's going to carry it on for the next 5 years? And then that gives you an idea of the depth of the leadership and the abilities of the leadership. People like Alligator, Jumper in his time. There was King Philip was another one. Very brilliant. And of course, we can't forget Kawakachi or Wildcat. Amazing men who understood the nature of guerrilla warfare, as we now call it, or asymmetrical warfare, whatever you wish. They were brilliant at it. The Americans had never, ever faced anyone so good as the Seminole leadership at that time.
They had great leadership, and they were prepared for the war. How did they prepare for the war?
Well, they're primarily doing the planting on the various islands in the Cove of the Withlacoochee. Again, that's another place where once the Army finally did get in there, it wasn't until the 1840-41 campaigns that they did, they found amazing growth of food, etc. Remember the story that Sprague talks about when he was interviewing Tiger Tail, or mentions, talks about tiger tails. He told him, or it was an indirect story. But tiger tail, in 1841, they go to the Homosassa River. Hoffman's 6th Infantry comes through there, and they destroy all those crops that he had been planting for years in that area. They had not been touched by the Army until that invasion on the Homosassa. And he's looking down, he's hiding in the tall water oak or Chinese, whatever oak kind of tree you talk about. Well, I would say probably a water oak at that time. But he's way up in the tree. He's obviously well concealed, and the Army wasn't looking that high up probably. And he's seeing his crops destroyed. He knew right then and there the fights went over. And 2 months later, whatever they carried out of encampment fleeing the Army was all they had. And once that was gone, he had to surrender. I mean, it kind of tells you they knew they had stashes and caches, if you will, of materials, weapons, lead especially, and things like that they had taken from the various plantations, particularly on the East Coast, and put them in places that they would have down the line. It's, it's amazing how well they were able to constantly do that. Now, as you know, later on, they run short of things like lead and powder, and try to trade with them. That was one of the things that angered Jessup the most. They would come into places like Fort Mellon, presumably to negotiate, trade with the local trader or whatever, which they allowed them to do, which you kind of scratch your head on that one too. And they walk out of there with more lead and powder and a few other things, and next thing you know, they're back at war because they were just replenishing their supplies. And Jessup saw through that, and that's what angered him most. He says, here I am negotiating with him, and he turns right around and uses the same stuff we traded with him to kill my men, as any commanding officer would do. He went after them. And did he finally violate some of the rules of war? Yeah, you put up a white flag and they all come together and capture them. That's a violation of most rules of war in any society that I know of. But Jessup felt very justified in doing so because I'd let them come in at least twice and they traded and turned right around and killed my men. I can't let that go on.
Today we might say the Seminole were world-class scourgers because they, as you say, they were able to trade. They were able to either use it with ruses, with negotiations. They got shipwrecks, and they pulled things off the bodies of soldiers killed in battle. That leads to a larger thing of they also suffered great privations. What type of privations decimated the Seminole during this war?
Well, first of all, you have disease. And people seem to forget that. Now, Christopher Monaco has done a great job. In a recent essay he published, I think it was last year, 2 years ago. It's a fantastic look, for the first time ever that I know of, at what kind of medicines were going on and what kind of health problems there were. And the Seminoles suffered from a lot of those same things that the soldiers did. After all, they're human beings, so darn good ones too. They suffered from the disease. The privation when the Army did go through and burn everything they could get, slash and burn kind of concept, that deprived the Seminoles of some of those caches and some of the fertility of some of the fields they had. And don't forget, Florida does not have a lot of fertile land when it comes to what we normally think of as cash crops down the line. The Seminoles, of course, that's why they grew the beans, why they grew the squash and pumpkin. They'll grow darn near anywhere if you know what to do with them. And basically it's putting the seed in, you hope, somewhat fertile ground. And they knew how to, of course, use fertilizer. They knew how to, I go back to the days of Benjamin Hawkins when he went through the Lower Creek tribe, and he's talking about, these people, the headman of the local town is living in a two or three story building with cedar shake shingles, clapboard siding. Some of them even had glass windows, for crying out loud. A lot of the frontiersmen on Georgia didn't have that, I might add. So you had that kind of thing going for it. Plus, with the interdiction of trade with the Bahamas and with Cuba, and even the Spanish fishermen to a point, you deprive the Seminoles of a lot of the trade goods and the ability to trade what they did have. Therefore, you're not getting the inflow of foodstuffs, fish, or weapons and lead, etc. It's going to lead to some privation because you can't go hunting And of course, the other thing too is you now have to revert back in many ways, as by the way, Hillis Hadjo had encouraged them to go back to the old-fashioned way of hunting, primarily with bow and arrow. Whereas you go shooting, you're going to give away your location. So, and many Seminoles took that to heart. There's not a lot. It's kind of interesting that there's not a lot of mention of it, but every so often you will see that somebody was killed with an arrow, and you kind of scratch your head saying, they were still using bows and arrows? Hell yeah. To use what you can get. And the Seminoles were very adaptable at doing that. It's just the creativity of the farmers or the agricultural people in the Seminole and Miccosukee tribe. Stop and think, and then I want everyone to think about it. You're coming from the wiregrass country of southwest Georgia and southeastern Alabama, in that area going out all the way up to Tallapoosa, etc. Totally different culture and different climate and different soil types in those areas that you find when they were forced down further in Florida by the Moultrie Creek in 23, coming down 1823, coming down and forced into the area around the Ocala center, if you will, on the Ocala National Forest, which is anything but an agricultural paradise, even today. It's scrub pine, sand, some loamy soils in the areas of the water bodies, so it takes a totally different way to survive. One of my favorite stories is Surveyor Leroy May, a colonel in the Tennessee militia under Jackson, came down to survey in that area near Silver Springs, and he came across an old Indian friend of his that he had met in northern Florida, Madison County, where they were from, and he was stopped from surveying, and he asked, "Why are you trying to stop me?" And we looked at him, and he said, "Well, quite seriously, those mules look pretty good to us. We haven't had any meat here in a long time." And the headman of the group, John Hicks, took him around and showed him the 20 or 25 lodges, and they looked in, and there was just one hind quarter of a deer, the only meat available for the entire settlement. No wonder those mules looked pretty good. Give you an idea that it was not an area of agricultural prosperity at any time. Still isn't that great of an agricultural area, as we all know. There are pockets, obviously, but other places, no, it's not. That is one of the reasons why you had William Pope Duvall, James Gadsden, and others basically told, and of course Ged Humphreys, the Indian agent, told the government that was not good property. That's not good land. These people can't live on that. And you're just going to create more problems, which indeed it did. But as a result, they did expand the boundaries a little bit further north to get into some more fertile areas over in today's Hernando and Pasco counties, over near Chicochatty, for example, which was a prominent Indian settlement area for a while. And then, of course, when you stop and think, the final move they go is into the Everglades, which is a totally different ecosystem, and you're basically farming individual islands in the Everglades themselves, islands being the higher ground, etc. And they're growing, when you take a look at what the Army destroyed on the various raids, stop and think about it. I mean, they're talking about acres of pumpkins and other types of squash and beans, even corn in certain areas. That is an adaptability that I don't see in any other tribe in American history. So that's one of the reasons why I call them extraordinarily creative. It also, basically is their basis of supply. And therefore, as you and I have talked about before in private conversation, the logistics. The Seminoles knew how to store and get food into certain areas.
Terrain also played a part.
Terrain is the biggest enemy of the United States Army, especially. They had no idea what kind of materials to use. When they, for example, finally went up Fish Eating Creek in 1842, they had to import the canoes, the Army did. They were roughly 30 feet long and about 4 feet wide and carried 10 to 12 men and accoutrements and drew 9 inches of water. How's that for a statistic that nobody remembers? But you had to know this, and you had to have learned it from experience that this was the kind of thing that the Seminoles had already been using traditionally anyway. They were using very light draft vessels to go up and down the waterways, which, of course, Florida had at one time 7,700 water bodies in the state of Florida. Stop and think about it. 7,700 water bodies, and many of them are connected with streams and water flows during the rainy season. As surveyor Sam Reed observed, he's the founder of the Manatee Colony, by the way. Sam said, anything south of the Manatee River during the rainy season is underwater. The Seminoles knew where the high land was by then, and the Army did not. And of course, the fact they have to deal with marsh of a different type, that was the first real time they'd ever looked into a swamp type of war. And of course, I think George Bucher's fine work on riverine warfare in Florida gives you, the swamp sailors, gives you a fantastic view of what the whites had to do to try to stop the Seminoles. They had no idea. Jessup, of course, kind of understood things better than most when it came to terrain and use of the terrain, and also what to order. His orders for equipment and boats, etc., are very, very telling in his four-pronged attack in 1837-38, which, by the way, led to the actual first surveying and relatively accurate drawings of Lake Okeechobee. Remember, the famous John Lee Williams map doesn't include Lake Okeechobee, because John Lee had a strict rule that unless he could verify it through an eyewitness or people who lived in the area, he would not include it. Well, no one lived out there that he talked to. He talked to Bill Cooley and others who had traded with the Seminoles for many years, and they couldn't give him a very good description of it, so he didn't include it. However, as we found up at West Point, the map that was produced up there by Anderson and others, it is extraordinarily accurate. I have a great copy, and I think I used it, and don't know if I used it in this book or one of the other books that I have, but on the Seminole Wars, we have that map, and it's a beauty. And when you take a look at the later maps in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century, you'll see that the shape didn't change all that much and how accurate that map was. But then again, you have rainy season and wet times, so therefore you've always got that problem. And the American government and people living in Florida, or people who were just coming in Florida at the time, had no idea of the rain cycle in Florida, nor did they have really a great idea. They obviously knew what a hurricane was, but not the ferocity that we get going across the state. And the fact that the Seminoles could tell by the way the animals and the insects reacted, etc., they knew when a storm was coming, so they hightailed it to the high land. That was one of the biggest fears that the Army learned was going to be a major problem if we'd ever had a hurricane during that time. And as you recall, Cedar Key was almost wiped out by one during the time of the Army occupation in the early 1840s. So they were still learning about Florida in the Second Seminole War. The one thing you always want to point out, by the way, is making a road at that time. Zachary Taylor's command, when he was in command here, produced roughly, I think it was 1,200 miles of roads in Florida. That's the first time we've ever had any roads in the interior. Stop and think about it, folks. This is we're talking 1838, 39, and this is when most of that road building was done. It's an amazing accomplishment by the United States Army, I might add, and the engineers and the pioneers who worked with the various units. But that's the first time we ever had any interior connections for a lot of these places. I mean, yes, you could follow Indian trails, which in many cases followed animal trails. They don't want to get their feet wet either. So as a result, it just takes a long time to start comprehending the impact the Seminole Wars had on Florida. It was tremendous. Very few people recognized that contribution. Positive contribution in many ways. It wasn't for the Seminoles per se, but it sure was for the Army and white settlers later. They followed those trails, and that's, of course, a lot of the early settlements, particularly under the Armed Occupation Act and later, that's where they took place, was along those trails.
In our talk about terrain, it got me thinking of a sports analogy, which is, home field advantage. And the Seminole definitely had home field advantage. One of the things about home field advantage we may think about, say, in football is most teams don't want to play at Lambeau Field in late December. They don't want to play in Foxborough, Massachusetts in late December. And yet a Super Bowl was held at the Dolphin Stadium, and it rained the entire time. The Seminole knew the climate, and the Army knew it enough that the pestilence and so forth that came in with the much warmer weather, they stopped campaigning. And then the Seminoles got a breather so they could recover. And it wasn't until later in the war that the Army said, heck with this, we're going to have to go for 12 months a year campaigning. And then the conflict seemed to turn at that point. So discuss the climate advantage that the Seminole had, and how the Army eventually adapted to that.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head here. The Seminoles did have the home field advantage, understood what the field was like. They understood the cycle of water. People don't know that it was the medical corps that was required to keep the temperature, the rain, amount of rain, wind directions, etc., which they did with some degree of accuracy, I might add. That is the first real record or recording of Florida weather patterns was by the Army Medical Corps during the Second Seminole War. It was required. And that's why we've got records going back at Fort Brooke in Tampa, going back to the I think it goes back to 1832 as the first of these records. They published them. I've got a copy of them somewhere. They published these things quite a few years ago, and you'd be surprised how patterns are now they start seeing these patterns, and the Army started adapting. Well, obviously during the wet season, we can't go anywhere because it's so wet. Everything, any kind of vehicle we have bogs down, and horses are going to get their mouths stuffed with mosquitoes, and all sorts of miasmas come out of the slum that are to kill us, like yellow fever and dengue fever, etc. So it's a serious matter. And once they start understanding that, and that's when they can start ordering stuff. By the way, the surveyors did the same thing. All surveys in Florida, the early surveys up to and after the Civil War, were done during the dry season, because you can't get anywhere. You're not going to get any crews to sign up to go work in the middle of the swamp in the rainy season. They all do better. And that's another little thing that I learned from the being the historian for the surveyors in Florida for 28 years. Got to understand a lot of what those guys had to go through, which was similar to what the military had to put up with. And it ain't fun to read some of this stuff, what they had to go through and what the military obviously went through too. And again, I bring the point out that, like I said, 35 to 40% of our soldiers were foreign-born, had no experience or familiarity with anything in the New World. And here they are being tossed into this war against a I would call them very sophisticated guerrilla force that knew exactly how to fight this war. And you just stop and think about, say you're a young German immigrant, you don't speak English, or you're a Polish immigrant, as we found on the Withlacoochee River, who were put under a German sergeant who didn't speak Polish and gave his orders in German and by hand directions. And then they tried to cross the Withlacoochee, and half of that patrol drowns because they don't understand. They're not supposed to do what the sergeant was trying to tell them not to do. Yeah, are you getting an indication of just how disorganized things are? And of course, the officers are all, by this point in time, 37, 38, you're getting so many West Pointers, they're giving their instructions in English. They don't know any other language besides French. And don't forget, French was the main language for reading military text at West Point in the 1830s. You know that, and a lot of other people, it still is in certain cases up there. It doesn't hurt to have a little bit of background on Chamonix, and he wrote in French and didn't translate until much later, because all educated people have that. Well, here is this highly educated West Pointer giving directions to a sergeant who may or may not understand English well, and he turns around and he's from Germany and he's talking to his Polish soldiers. You're not going to communicate very well. And as you know, every officer, even this, especially now at West Point, you had better know how to communicate quickly, concisely, and precisely exactly what it is you want done.
How miserable, Joe, how miserable was it to be a soldier, a private in the U.S. Army in Florida in the 1830s?
You didn't want to be one. First of all, and the most obvious thing, the brutality. that officers practiced at that time. There were some who were essentially sadist, if you will, Hunt being one of them. You recall the story about him. A young gentleman had the fever. He was a private. Had fever, and he was sent out to Picolata, which had a hospital at the time. Medical care being what it was, that's not being much, okay? The young man had a fever of well over 100. He was ordered to go back to St. Augustine. The doctor had said, no, you don't want to take this man, he's sick. And the order was he was going to do this. And the kid starts stumbling and comes up to him and starts beating the living daylights out of him with a cane. Says, you will do this. He wanted to actually beating the young man to death. And even other officers were willing to testify against him. But he was put into a military court of his peers, other officers. And they exonerated him, stating basically that the young man had disobeyed a direct order. Yeah, 100+ fever, you're sick, and you've been sick in the hospital in Picolata, and you're going to walk in the heat from there to St. Augustine? Yeah, it was a brutal thing. Not only that, but your supplies that you would get. I mean, the shortchanging and the dilution. There was one investigation that's in the Quartermaster General's records that talks about how much sand was allotted in the sugar allotment. You could have 1/3 of your poundage that you paid for in sand if you were dealing in the sugar. You diluted the sugar with the sand. And they're supposed to drink this? And of course, the coffee was, everything from chicory all the way up to maybe even real coffee at times. God forbid. I mean, there are incidences where people were actually grinding up burnt corn cobs and using that as coffee because it tasted better than what they were getting from the Army. I mean, you can go on and on and on how much spoiled beef, etc. I mean, I don't know if they ever got anything that didn't have half spoilage in it. It was, the situation of supplies at that time. We had a commissary general. We had who may or may not have had men on top of the game at that particular time. Most of the time were not. The corruption that was involved in all of that. I mean, sutlers were paid off, even though the sutlers were not the main provider of food, we might add. Sutlers are a separate store to provide things that the men may want or think they need that the Army does not normally ration to them. Water supplies, oh my God. The rancid water, they did for some reason or other, even though I'm sure they knew of it at the time, boiling water was not required. It should have been, but they didn't. Sanitation was bad, but the surprising number to me, and I put this out there for people to understand, the sanitation, they knew how to dig a latrine, they knew they don't put it on top of their drinking water, etc. Third Seminole War, and going back to the Second Seminole War, they knew enough that you, don't build a camp on the same place that you built it previously because you still had, you just covered it with loose dirt, so you still got flies hanging around and all sorts of things 5-6 months later. I mean, stuff doesn't decay overnight, folks. Amazing what they did understand, and the typhoid rate in the Seminole Wars, either the first, or the second, or the third, was actually less than the Spanish-American War. And it's an amazing statistic. However, then you have malaria. Then you have other diseases that were just going through and wiping them out. Mumps. People don't realize measles was a deadly disease back then. And every so often measles would go through and it would kill a number of soldiers. You don't think of that. It's a childhood's disease. I got news for you. No, it isn't. It's one of those situations that I think Chris Monaco's work is a pioneering effort in getting that kind of thing out to the forefront right now.
Joe, thanks for talking to us.
Not a problem.
Joe, you outlined a lot of stuff. It sounds like it's a pretty depressing, miserable place to have a war for all parties involved. We're going to come back, though, in our second episode. We're going to talk about a larger picture. We're going to talk about the bigger picture, which is underlying causes for the war, where some of the action took place, and then what were the strategies, operations, and tactics that either side engaged in, and whether it was a war of extinction, a war of annihilation, a war of exhaustion, a war of attrition, or some combination of all of those in our second episode. So thanks for being with us today.
If you enjoyed this show, please take a moment to like us on Facebook at Seminole Wars Foundation. Leave a review on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. Your reviews and comments help new listeners discover us and help us keep the show going. Visit our website at www.seminolewars.us for blogs, articles, news, books, events, membership information, and how to subscribe to this podcast. We'll be back soon with a new episode of the Seminole Wars podcast. The Seminole Wars Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to preservation, education, and publication of Seminole Wars history throughout the state of Florida. This podcast is copyrighted the Seminole Wars Foundation 2021. All rights reserved. Front bumper music, The Devil's Garden, Roast 'em, provided by kind permission of Reedy Unman. Back bumper music, Second Seminole Win, by Jed Merrim and Ricky Pittman, courtesy of Ricky Pittman. All rights reserved.